this partnership with UFRJ and McMaster has started in 2018 when I first met Henry. And it was a really wonderful meeting where we decided to develop together some thinking and some research. At that time, the CAPES started to make project about internationalization of Brazilian universities, and Henry was really open and start share with me this moment of building some good ideas together. So in 2019 and 2020, I was with Henry as a visiting professor at the Cultural Studies Department in McMaster University in Canada. And it was a really wonderful time that we had together. And we had a video and books that we are making together. So no more words. Henry Giroux is the chair of scholarship in the public interest and the Paulo Freire Distinguished Scholar in Critical Pedagogy. To develop a critical theory on the intersection of education and the cultural studies, Henry advocates for the need to make pedagogy central to politics itself, developing critical citizens and a meaningful and substantive democracy. Giroux have updated critical ideas for the 21st century. Is a warrior against the inequality or social, cultural, economic inequalities, as he loved to say, stressing the value of the economic inequalities for the culture, and the neoliberal machine that reproduces it, acting as the history had been finished yet. So Henry always remember us. History is open. Henry Giroux is undoubtedly an important contemporary thinker, and he put emphasis on the role of public intellectuals in building a language of possibility. As he says, history is open. Even in the darkest times, we have the right for some light. So Giroux will bring us on this afternoon hope and light, but also I'm sure he will make us a call to mobilize, to make collective and public acts. And the speech he is going to give us tonight, this afternoon, is called Pandemic Politics and the Scourge of Depolitization. So Henry, I'm really thankful for your presence here with us. So you can start your speech, please.
Thank you, Gustavo. And I want to thank everyone for attending. I am really honored to be here. I was in Brazil many years ago with Paulo Freire. I have very fond memories of Brazil, to say the very least. And today I'm basically going to build on the notion of inequality by framing it within the context of the pandemic. And the pandemic in this sense is not just a medical issue, it's also a pandemic that refers to political and pedagogical crises. And what that means in terms of the times in which we live, particularly with the rise of various forms of authoritarianism. So with that said, let me begin. We now live in a world that resembles a dystopian novel that could only be imagined as a harrowing work of fiction or biting political commentary. If you think of the works of George Orwell, Sinclair Lewis, and others who have written in this venue, their work now almost appears as an understatement in a world marked by horrifying political horizons. This is a world in which authoritarian and medical pandemics have merged. In this age of uncertainty, time and space have collapsed into an abyss of shared apprehensions, relentless anxieties, and the possibility of an authoritarian abyss. The terror of everyday life points to a world that has begun, so it appears, to descend into darkness. Death and sickness haunt our existence as the pandemic spreads through those establishments those spaces, materials that impact on the most intimate aspects of our daily lives. Images of fear, if not apocalyptic visions, flood the news as increasing numbers of people either get sick or die from the COVID-19 virus. We can no longer shake hands, embrace our friends, feel safe using public transportation, sitting inside a restaurant or a movie theater, doorknobs, counters, the breath we inhale, and anything else that offers the virus a resting place has become comparable to a kind of ticking bomb, ready to explode, resulting in massive suffering and, to say the very least, untold deaths. Long-term stretches of self-isolation for the privileged begin to feel, so the press reports, like a form of imprisonment. But on the other hand, for the poor, the disadvantaged, and the elderly, there are no safe places, only the daily risk of contamination, sickness, or worse. Amid this collective terror, the architecture of authoritarianism has resurfaced with a vengeance, especially in the United States, and in a more minor key, to say the very least, in Brazil, in the form of a kind of waking nightmare with a cast of horrors. Surveillance technologies proliferate. Armed militia defend groups refusing to wear protective masks and intimidate those who do. Voter suppression in the United States has preceded the presidential election in full swing. Conspiracy theories are now pushed by President Trump even after his defeat. Immigrant children were forcibly separated from their parents and put in cages in migrant detention centers, sometimes with no hopes of reuniting with their families. The COVID-19 plague points to more than a medical pandemic and must be understood within a more comprehensive historical, political, and ideological context. The COVID-19 crisis is deeply rooted in years of neglect by neoliberal governments that denied the importance of public health, the public good, and the commons, while defunding institutions that made them possible. The current pandemic cannot be removed from the crisis of massive inequalities in wealth, income, and power that have grown relentlessly since the 1970s. In this case, the disproportionate effects of the virus on those marginalized by race, by class, and age can be seen as part of the long-standing and broader struggles over public health, goods, social protections, services, and human rights, with special provisions for the most vulnerable, including the precariat, migrant workers, and indigenous peoples, not to mention, of course, the elderly. None of these issues can be separated from the broader struggles for social equality, economic justice, and democracy. Nor can the current pandemic be separated from the crisis of democratic values, critical education, and the civic imagination. Underlying the current magnitude of the current pandemics we now face, there's the crucial question of what kind of world do we want to live in today? What kind of world do we want to build for young people, for future generations? The COVID-19 pandemic has revealed the ugly and cruel face of an extreme form of capitalism, which has relentlessly attacked the social contract, the public sphere, and the common good. Bear with me as I will use the term neoliberalism to define this libertarian, market-driven form of casino capitalism, which gained prominence in Chile under General Pinochet in the 1970s. Soon afterwards, as we all know, it was embraced by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, who infamously said, "There's no such thing as society. There's only individual men and women and their families." In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan in the United States joined Thatcher and argued that government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. These ideas, of course, were later embraced with great enthusiasm by not only Stephen Harper, the former Prime Minister of Canada, but also currently by Bolsonaro in Brazil, of course, in India, in Hungary, in Poland, and a number of other countries. This lingering malignancy now dominates, in many ways, states that were formerly democratic, but are now increasingly moving towards the status of becoming authoritarian dictatorial societies. Central to these societies is a neoliberal worldview that argues in different ways that the market should govern not only the economy, but all of society. In addition, it promotes untrampled self-interest, indulgent individualism, a survival of the fittest ethos, and most of all, it removes economic activity from social cost. Ultimately, in doing this, it removes political and economic activity from the very notion of ethics and social responsibility. Its ultimate purpose is the concentration of wealth, of course, in the hands of a financial elite. Neoliberal fascism views government as the enemy of the market, embraces a fixed hedonism, and challenges the very idea of the common good. Moreover, it represents a new social and political formation that combines the harshest elements of a cutthroat capitalism with an unabashed embrace of white supremacy and what I would call, and Gustavo and I have talked about this, a politics of disposability. Neoliberal fascism has created, particularly in the United States, through its destruction of the economy, the environment, education, and public health care, a kind of petri dish for COVID-19 to wreak havoc and wide-scale destruction. And of course, you know better than I, this is also true for Brazil under the incompetent and corrupt Bolsonaro. What the COVID-19 crisis made clear is that the market could not provide basic social provisions and meet public health needs posed by the pandemic. Its anti-public and anti-democratic ethos was at odds with the crucial demands of civic leadership, given its long-standing belief that the priority of capital, capital should take priority over human needs. Not surprisingly, over time, public goods have withered and begun to fail. That is, the publicly owned bones of society, public education, public health system, roads, bridges, water systems, were underfunded and pushed to the breaking point of disrepair and dysfunctionality. Drained of civic values and lacking a commanding vision, the institutions of liberal democracy atrophied, undermining not only civic obligations, informed and engaged citizens, but also historical memory and the capacity to discern the truth from falsehoods. It must be made clear that neoliberalism is not just an economic system, but also an ideological and cultural system that functions as a powerful educational force. Its presence is on display in the rise of corporate-controlled social media that have accelerated a culture of surveillance, consumption, immediacy, and in many ways, self-absorption. In this overabundance of civic glut, language has succumbed to the aesthetics of vulgarity. What is new about the current historical moment is that the attack on the welfare state, the common good, and those considered disposable is increasingly legitimated through oppressive forms of education in a variety of sites, such as newspapers, social media, magazines, and popular culture. The merging of culture, power, and politics represents a new stage in the development of capitalist society, one that is, of course, accelerated by the new technologies, one in which left-leaning and mainstream cultural apparatuses, from schools to the digital media, are now under attack, while the right-wing media, which has enormous amounts of money and capital and power at its disposal, push authoritarian impulses and minority rule, displacing the necessity of tanks or massive displays of state violence in some cases. Authoritarian populism and economic nationalism are now normalized in an anti-democratic culture that is constructed through the deep grammar of education that intensifies the struggle over consciousness, over agency, and over values in a wide variety of sites. I mean, this is a struggle over agency. This is not just simply a struggle over power or a struggle over economic apparatuses. It's a struggle of over how we define ourselves, our relationship to others, and of course, the larger world. This is a stage and landscape in which willful ignorance, the disdain of science, the repudiation of evidence and expert advice are treated with either indifference or contempt, all of which is evident, of course, in Trump's denial regarding election results, not to mention his denial of the science behind what needs to happen with respect to, in some way, addressing the pandemic. Moreover, this culture of denial, with its contempt for evidence, justice, and democracy, is reinforced and reciprocated at the highest levels of government. Far from being objective sources of information or innocent forms of entertainment, new and powerful cultural apparatuses have become disinformation and disimagination machines that dehumanize people of color, promote spectacles of violence, militarize public space, and endorse consumerism as the only viable form of citizenship. This emptying out of social relationships, democratic values, and visions of the good life is a powerful force for legitimating and normalizing a language of exclusion, white supremacy, militarism, and ultranationalism. It's an attempt to destroy any viable notion of democracy as a foundation for civic and political life as we know it and as we have known it. One result is that the distinction between fact and fiction disappears. And somewhere along the way, the democratization of the flow of information becomes the democratization of the flow of disinformation. Lost here is a critical language capable of producing a narrative that promotes shared values and enables people to develop sustained connections crucial to a vibrant democracy. All of this is on display in Trump's campaign of misinformation and lies about both the pandemic and about almost everything else. And of course, again, this is entirely true of Bolsonaro. As a tabloid anti-intellectual who thrives in a culture of spectacle, entertainment, and distraction, Trump drains politics of any substantive meaning, given his attempts to both infantilize and to depoliticize the public, while disdaining any effort at critical analysis, translation, or self-reflection. Trump's ignorance, in some ways, and I would say this is true for Bolsonaro as well, is almost hallucinatory in that it operates out of an alternative reality that is so removed from reality that it speaks to a pathology so deep-seated, it becomes difficult actually at times to categorize. And all that's left in the midst of this is what the great theorist Viktor Frankl once called the mask of nihilism. The alarm and fear produced by the pandemic often blinds us to the fact that a range of anti-democratic and economic and political forces have been grinding away at the social order for the last 50 years. As engaged citizens, it's crucial, it would seem to me, to examine the anti-democratic and iniquitous political, economic, and social forces that in many ways have fed the pandemic, and it seems to me to struggle at the same time for public health and the common good by linking struggles for emancipation, equity, and economic justice to democracy itself. What is difficult to understand today is that oppressive forms of education have now become central elements of a society threatened by a number of pandemics that endanger human life and the planet itself. The propaganda machines of the right-wing media echo the Trump regime's support for disparaging ideas, for lies about testing, and fake cures for the virus. Remember, this was a president who once suggested we should inject bleach into our blood systems to somehow prevent ourselves from getting the virus. It seems to me that the coronavirus pandemic now works in tandem with corporate media conglomerates to produce identities narrowly defined by market values, while normalizing stripped down notions of individual responsibility that convinces people that whatever problems that they face in some way have no one to blame but themselves. In this logic, individual interests are the only reality that really matters, and those interests are purely monetary. This, to me, is one of the most deadly elements of neoliberalism, because it basically says that all problems are basically individual problems. And when we argue that, it seems to me that what we do is we prevent people from being able to translate private issues into larger social considerations. And so it seems to me this ideology seems to suggest that there are only individual solutions to socially produced problems. This is a massive form of depoliticization. This ideology reinforces states of individual isolation and alienation, while it increasingly renders human beings numb, fearful, and immune to the demands of economic and social justice, all of which are increasingly removed from matters of politics or matters of ethics and from matters of social responsibility. Dealing with life's problems becomes a solitary affair, reducing matters of social responsibility to a regressive and depoliticized notion of individual choice. In this instance, the political becomes regressively personal, rendering difficult any critical understanding, as I've said earlier, of wider systemic forces, while undermining any viable notion of critical agency, and particularly collective resistance. As the connections between education and democracy wither, hope becomes the enemy of agency. And agency is reduced to learning how to survive rather than working to improve the conditions that bear down on one's life and society in general. This paralyzing form of depoliticization, with its refiguring of the social sphere, more like its elimination of the social sphere, individual responsibility, historical memory, critical thinking, and collective identity, reinforces an acute indifference, withdrawal from public life, and a disdain for politics, or a disdain for politics, contributing further to the loss of what we might call the habits of engaged and critical citizenship. The pandemic has shattered the myth that each of us are defined exclusively by our self-interest, and as individuals are solely responsible for the problems that we face. Both myths run the risk of breaking down as it becomes obvious that as the pandemic unfolds, shortages in crucial medical equipment, lack of testing, lack of public investments, and a failed public health services are largely due to right-wing neoliberal measures such as regressive tax policies, bloated military budgets, and other such expenses that have drained resources from public health, public goods, and other vital social institutions such as public and higher education. All of this, of course, also succumbs to the logic of privatization, the logic of consumerism, commercialism, efficiency, and standardization. Unfortunately, the political and economic crisis many countries are experiencing has not been matched by what I call a crisis of ideas. That is, a critical understanding of the conditions that produced the crisis in the first place. Within this crisis of ideas, matters of poverty, class difference, and racial injustices disappear. The COVID plague has produced an age of uncertainty, fragmentation, and despair, and a dire foreboding about the future. More troubling is the apprehension that the present crisis has an air of longevity about it, constituting what seems to be an almost irreversible turning point in history. The good news is that the pandemic has revealed in all of its ugliness the death-producing mechanisms of institutional racism, the increasingly dangerous assault on the environment, and an anti-intellectual culture that derides the notion of critical education. That is, an education that equips individuals to think critically, engage in thoughtful dialogue, learn the lessons of history, and develop the capacity, at the very most, to hold power accountable. The pandemic has torn away the cover of a neoliberal economic system marked by what Thomas Piketty calls the violence of social inequality. Inequality is a toxin that destroys lives, democratic institutions, historical consciousness, civic literacy, and is normalized through politicians and right-wing media culture, reduce the sounding boards for the rich and the powerful. Power has been made visible, and with it, the hope for change. The pandemic has done more than expose the cult of capitalism and its production of social inequalities operating on a vast scale in the United States and in Brazil and around the globe. It has also revealed the inner workings of an authoritarian politics exemplified by the blundering and dangerous regime of Donald Trump, whose potential re-election, the editorial board of the New York Times, no leftist newspaper, stated poses the greatest threat to American democracy since World War II. Of course, this characterization would also have to apply to Bolsonaro. And according to the Times, Trump degraded the office of the president by normalizing the unthinkable, legitimizing the inexcusable, and defending the indefensible. The Trump administration has been more concerned about the health of the economy than saving lives, especially the lives of those marginalized by class, color, age, and pre-existing health conditions. Unwilling to admit his defeat at the hands of Joe Biden for the presidency, Trump has turned his back on the pandemic, which has become a firestorm in the US, which now averages 160,428 COVID cases per day. Because of Trump's failure to address the crisis, the United States has been turned into a giant cemetery. Through his rallies alone and his refusal to abide by health precautions, such as wearing a mask, Trump created conditions for infecting endless numbers of people. A study out of Stanford University asserted that his campaign rallies before the election led to over 30,000 infections and over 700 deaths. And because of this lack of leadership, the economy tanked, millions lost their job, and more than 274,000 people have died, and more than 14 million people are infected. Trump has blood on his hands, and his failure to address the pandemic's reach, severity, and danger is no longer an issue that can be ignored. What is also an issue that can't be ignored is that 70 million people voted for him in spite of these crimes, in spite of the fact that he has blood on his hand, in spite of the fact that he's an ignoramus, in spite of the fact that he basically believes in a fascist politics, in spite of the fact that he associates and aligns himself and welcomes and emboldens dictators all over the world. Call for Trump to recognize Joe Biden as the winner of the election, raise the minimum wage, support decent and safe work, offer access to affordable housing, provide universal health care, lower prescription drug costs, provide a free quality education for everyone, expand infrastructure, defund the military and the police, and invest in community services are certainly important reforms that are difficult to disagree with, unless you support Trump. But they do not deal with the larger issue of restructuring a market-driven economic system, which is steeped in massive racial and economic inequalities. As the renowned educator David Harvey has argued, the immediate task is nothing more or less than the self-conscious construction of a new political framework for approaching the question of inequality and racism through a deep and profound critique of our economic and social system, if not an entire restructuring of our economic and social system. If casino capitalism contributed to the unraveling of social connections and the institutions that support them, the pandemic made it clear how vital such connections are to both public health, the public health of a society, and its democratic institutions. Young people and others are recognizing that the social spheres that are privatized, commercialized, and individualized make it difficult to translate, once again, private issues into systemic considerations. Under such circumstances, inequality becomes normalized, and the pandemic crisis is isolated from the political, economic, social, and cultural conditions that fuel it, intensify it, and make it worse. Crucial to any politics of resistance is the necessity to take seriously the notion that education is central to politics itself, and that social problems have to be critically understood before people can act as a force for empowerment and liberation. Marx said that the point is not to interpret the world, but to change it. He was only partially right, because you have to understand the world before you can change it. And so it seems to me that in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, matters of criticism, informed judgment, and critical modes of understanding are crucial in order to make a distinction between democracy and authoritarianism, lies and misinformation, life and death. The stock choices regarding what the future might look like appears to hang between the forces of despotism and democracy. Yet, as ominous as this crisis appears, as my friend Gustavo mentioned, history is open, and how it will unfold hangs in the balance. The pandemic is a crisis that cannot be allowed to turn into a catastrophe in which all hope is lost. And while this pandemic threatens democracy's ability to breathe, it should also offer up the possibility to rethink politics and the habits of critical education, human agency, and elements of social responsibility crucial to any viable notion of what life would be like in a democratic society. Amid the corpses produced by neoliberal capitalism and COVID-19, there are emerging flashes of hope, especially among young people who seem to be all that stands between a declining faith in democracy and the ghost of an ugly past. Beyond the normalizing ideologies of a poisonous cynicism and a paralyzing conformity endemic to neoliberal capitalism, there is a growing global movement protesting racism, state violence, and economic inequality. There is a collective movement of resistance to a hyper-capitalist system that is out of control. It is a movement in search of a new language and includes investments in education and public health, a living wage, the creation of an economy that benefits all and not just a wealthy financial elite. It's a movement that refuses to accept the erosion of democratic ideals, decline of communal institutions, and the rise of a toxic culture of consumerism, greed, and self-interest, one that places profit over people. This is a movement attempting to reclaim a collective political vision that is more compassionate, more equitable, more just, and more inclusive. And it seems to me that central to its task is the necessity to create a unified democratic political formation, a revival of the civic imagination, and an inspired and energized struggle for a radical democracy, a socialist democracy. This is both a political project and an educational challenge, given the need to break through the corrosive common sense belief that there is no alternative to the existing society with its dangerous notions of agency, values, and its disregard for human life. The claims of neoliberal capitalism have been broken, and what was once unthinkable is now being said in public by large groups of people. Young people producing new and more critical narratives aimed at repairing the safety net, providing public investments in healthcare, childcare, elder care, and arguing for free quality education for all. Resistance movements are forming in the United States and across the globe to protect and expand the voting process, to address systemic police violence, racism, and to argue for universal health care and reform the criminal justice system, provide social provisions for everyone who needs them, and to end mass incarceration while protecting workers' rights, including the right to unionize, and a renewed call to support indigenous rights. There are increasing efforts to address state violence and the plagues of poverty, racism, homelessness, economic inequality, and the pollution of the planet. The spirit of an insurgent democracy is in the air. In spite of the ugly terror of authoritarianism that lurks in the background of the COVID-19 crisis, The pandemic can teach us that democracy is fragile as a way of life, and that if it's to survive, critical education, civic courage, historical consciousness, moral witnessing, and political outrage must become central elements of a pedagogical practice capable of producing citizens who are informed, politically aware, and willing to struggle to keep justice, equity, and the principles of a socialist democracy alive. This is a crisis in which various protests are now evolving internationally at the popular level and offer the promise of developing an invigorated global movement for the struggle of popular sovereignty and economic, racial, and social justice. Central to such struggles is the challenge of making good on the ideals and the promises of a radical democratic order. This is not just an economic and a political issue, but as I have said throughout this talk, a deeply educational issue. To confront the current crisis of authoritarianism in the United States, in Brazil, in Hungary, in India, and other countries, there's the need to create not only a radical shift in values, but a radical shift in consciousness. As Ariel Dorfman argues, it's time to create the cultural institutions and political conditions in multiple sites, ranging from the mainstream press to the online digital world, in order to, quote, unleash the courage, the energy, joy, and yes, compassion with which rebellious millions can defy fear and keep hope alive in these traumatic times. In the current moment, democracy may be under severe threat and appear frighteningly vulnerable. But with young people and others rising up across the globe, inspired, energized, and marching in the streets, the future of a radical democracy is waiting to be reimagined, if not reborn. In order for democracy to breathe again, it needs to resurrect a language of critique and possibility, one that draws from history, rethinks the meaning of politics, and provides the economic and political conditions to lift the US, Brazil, and other societies out of the present socio-political malaise so that the public can envision alternatives and build the institutions necessary for democracy to become a reality. Democracy needs a vision rooted in a deep politics of solidarity that enables people to both fight against the forces of authoritarianism and to overcome them. Goya was right when he warned, the sleep of reason produces monsters. Thank you.
Hello, Henry. Thank you for this great speech, full of energy and reason and monsters. That's exactly, Henry, what we are fighting here in Brazil, against big monsters who are trying to stop the reason. But, my dear friend, we are more clever than these monsters. And I'm sure that with your energy and all the collective fight for what you call for and this world movement for the planet and to save people and for social justice, certainly will beat hard in the Brazilian hearts who are listening you, because it has been hard to live right now in this crazy country. So Henry, thank you for your speech, and I like it a lot, you know, this sentence: democracy is fragile as a way of life. That's brilliant, brilliant, Henry. Democracy is fragile as a way of life. And as we are in a health center here in the university, you know, because the institute stays in the health center. So for us, this pandemic has beaten us in other terms. And right now in Brazil, it's starting the second wave without the first wave had finished. And they still think that nothing is going on, as the fake news It's the similar project as Trump does, like just to deny the reality, deny the fact. So really thank you for this sentence. Democracy is a fragile way, is fragile as a way of life. Really good. So we have some comments here, Henry. And so I'm gonna read some comments to you. So after that, I'm gonna make some questions, and so you can answer the questions, and we finish the session. So thank you. I'm gonna read the comments, okay? So for a beginner teacher like me, your words were a breath of hope and strength to keep fighting. Thank you for the words that feeds our hope. I am so grateful to hear some good critics about all this system that reproduces inequality. Professor Henri Giroux, thank you for your speech here in UFRJ. It's a crucial moment in our history in Brazil. Gave us reasons to keep resisting. You was even better today than in the interview video. Congratulations. Beautiful words, but hard to put in practice under an authoritarian culture. Excellent speech. We need more brave people as you to changing things, not normal post-pandemic world. Thank you, obrigado, thank you. So these were some comments, and so we have two more followed by a question. So the question is for talk a little bit about the pandemic and
What?
about the pandemic situation and how this pandemic just makes like a pedagogy. And I have other questions here. I'm gonna read them for you, and so you answer as you want, okay? So as we have lots of questions, I will make four and then four and we finish. How could we fight against the fake news? Can you please talk a little bit more about the micropolitics? In the video, you use the expression microaggressions from neoliberalism against the democracy. What is the meaning of all this technological, digital, or virtual revolution for the citizenship and the political education? How to fight against this fascist neoliberalism, you say, in a pandemic and post-pandemic world? So, Henry, these are the first questions. As we have lots of questions, I think you could answer this, and then we have a second round, okay? It's okay for you?
Yeah. I mean, it's a very important question because it basically points to a couple of things. One is that the issue of culture has become the new terrain in which authoritarianism attempts to legitimate itself and to normalize its practices and values and social relations. And I think that when I talk about this new technology and this culture, I mean, my point is not to suggest that we can't fight it. My point is to recognize that it takes the question of education very seriously as an oppressive form as an oppressive narrative and as oppressive pedagogical practice, and we have to fight that by basically creating sites, working within existing sites, creating alternative media, and doing everything we can to expand those spaces of the culture where we can provide alternative narratives, where we can provide more emancipatory pedagogical practices, where we can basically create different stories about who we are and what democracy means and how you make power accountable and inspire people to come together and in some ways to be able to be more self-reflective about the conditions that oppress them. So it seems to me that what we're talking about here is we're talking about using multiple sites to expand, in some ways, what I would call the practice of civic literacy. You know, the practice of civic formation, the practice of civic courage, the practice of civic enlightenment. I mean, what does it mean and what are the elements of that? The elements of that is learning about history. The elements of that are learning how to basically understand logic, being informed, being led, having access to alternative views, supporting institutions that basically make free speech possible, having a vision of what the relationship is between knowledge and engaged citizenship and critical citizenship. So I think that all of those issues are kind of crucial in recognizing that we need to invent not only a new politics, we need to invent a new understanding of cultural politics and what that means.
Another person just asked us here about the internal monsters. She says, oh, Henry, okay, we have these macro structural just pressuring us as the state pressuring us, but what about ourselves? How we act and how we can resist and how we can to react. So she asked you to, if you can talk a little bit about how these monsters, against reason can be internalized by ourselves.
I mean, what becomes clear is that when we're talking about domination, we're not just talking about external forces. We're talking about how people internalize these forces and how they're led to believe in things that basically are not only not in their self-interest, but in many ways produce depression, produce isolation, produce massive anxieties. What does it mean to live in a culture of shared fears rather than, it seems to me, shared responsibilities? What it means is that hate becomes more important than compassion. It means that resentment becomes more important than love. It means that injustice becomes more important than justice. It means that we fight each other based on an ethos that seems to suggest that there's only one person left on the island. So there is an internalization of these issues that has to be dealt with. I mean, these have a subjective component that basically speak to matters of emotion, affect, questions of subjectivity, but also how are agencies being produced in ways in which those monsters become internalized and prevent people from acting in their own self-interest in ways that correspond with improving the interest of the common good and allowing us to be compassionate. I mean, I think that one thing that I find enormously disturbing about the issue with respect to that question is the willingness of people to engage and justify and normalize a culture of cruelty under neoliberalism, and to, in some ways, adopt the values that make it possible, and to fight against people who basically are fighting for justice. I mean, we've internalized, for instance, a notion of freedom under neoliberalism and capitalism that seems to suggest that freedom means you can be a racist and not have to worry about it. It's freedom without responsibility. It's freedom without a sense of how we're connected to each other in ways that demand compassion, justice, a sense of understanding, and a notion of collective caring. So it seems to me that I mean, to talk about monsters just being on the outside is silly. And also to do that doesn't explain why 70 million people voted for Trump. I mean, we have to ask ourselves, how do we deal with the mass psychology of fascism, as Wilhelm Reich once said? How do we understand this? How do we understand the making of identities that, in fact, verge on falling into the abyss of authoritarianism? Then there's another question. I'm sorry, there's one more question, and that is, how do we deal with the existential loneliness and atomization that comes with neoliberalism? And now, under the pandemic, is further amplified under the notion that we should self-isolate. I mean, to self-isolate for medical reasons is important, but you can't forget that you live in a society that tells you that you're always alone, and that being alone and caring about nobody else is all that really matters. So there's a sense in which we increasingly live in a void where it becomes difficult to make connections. And I think that causes massive mental illness. I think it causes massive forms of existential anxiety. It causes massive suffering. Social atomization is a curse that basically is endemic to massive forms of authoritarianism and economic inequality.
Very good, Henry. I have just some three more questions here. In your new book, you say there is a reason for this pandemic pedagogy. Can you better explain that? What would be this pandemic?
The pandemic pedagogy is a pedagogy that operates in the service of expanding and intensifying pandemics and leading people to believe that they're perfectly normal and that there's nothing that can be done about them. They just have to run their course. In the midst of the pandemic attempts to normalize, it seems to me, notions of surveillance, notions of authoritarianism, notions of helplessness, notions of powerlessness that degrade questions of scientific evidence, that degrade questions of critical culture, critical consciousness, that degrade the possibility for collective resistance, that degrade the possibility for agency. You know, when Bolsonaro says, "Oh, the pandemic is the COVID-19 is just like a flu," that's pandemic pedagogy. That's a form of pedagogy that leads people to believe in a lie. And a lie that basically not only affects their lives and their health, but is dangerous to society itself. Pandemic pedagogy is a way to spread information, knowledge, social relations, and valuables that allow power not to be held accountable.
Thank you, Henry. People also ask here for you to talk a little bit about political education. How could political education enter in the education of in the research at the university? So please talk a little bit for us about how could we do a political education?
Look, let me make a distinction first between two forms of education. At the very least, politicizing education is a form of education that says that I'm right and you have to believe what I say, and that my view is the only view. That's a form of propagandizing education. It's awful, it's authoritarian, and it should be banned. Political education is an education that says that, look, education is always a struggle over matters of agency. It's a struggle over the future. It's a struggle over identities. It's a struggle over values, and it's never removed from power. And so political education makes people aware of these issues and how education functions in those terms in ways to allow them to be more self-critical and more reflective and more informed and more historically aware of what the conditions are that function educationally that shape their very lives. And it seems to me, to begin with the question, how is education political, is to, in some way, not recognize that it's always political. There's no escaping a non-political education because we all make choices about the books we want, the curriculum we're going to implement, the forms of agency that we want to produce, how we intervene in social relationships and shape them, what images and notions of the world we legitimate. That's always political. I mean, I think the real question here is being aware of the power of education to create the conditions for people to be as critically and informed and engaged and to operate within the capacities to allow them to learn how to govern rather than be governed. Education has to be linked to notions of what I would call autonomous, individual, and collective agency. It has to have a vision that says we want to expand the capacities for students to be all they can in a world in which they learn how to both participate in that world and control the conditions that shape it. That's what I mean by political education.
Henry, thank you. I think you have answered most part of the question. So if there is something that people doesn't get right now, they can also watch the video with the interview because it was a good interview. And that documentary with your interview should be seen by these people who were here in this afternoon at this virtual place with us. I'm really thank you about your availability and for your strength and for all this partnership we are building in Brazil and Canada and McMaster and Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. But just before finishing, I would like also to congratulate you for your new book that it's going out right now, Race, Politics, and Pandemic Pedagogy, from Bloomsbury, New York, London. So congratulations. And there, I have seen there that you have 4 sessions, pandemic landscapes, populism, and the crisis of education, the promise of history, and thinking beyond plagues. So I think you have good material for us to thinking a little bit more here. And for people who doesn't speak Portuguese, I also have a good news, because Henry will publish with us in Federal University of Rio de Janeiro a new book on 21 on next year in Portuguese, because the last books that people were reading here from Henry was intellectuals and books that now don't show anymore this contemporary thinking of Henry Giroux. So next year we will have this book in Portuguese, and the name of the book is Education, Culture, and Fights for Democracy, Contemporary Writings of Henry Giroux Against the Neoliberal Machine. It will be Federal University of Rio de Janeiro publication, a public publisher. So thank you once more publicly for giving us the right to publish your recent work in Portuguese. That will be really important for us. And also thanks for Vera Siqueira and Andrea Costa, that were my partners in this co-edition for this book translation. So Henry, I'm gonna just thank you a lot and give you some few minutes to say goodbye for our invited people here.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm honored. I love working with Gustavo. I think that the work we're doing is very important. And I think that we have to collectively band together and do everything that we can to stop this fascist onslaught. I mean, I think that democracy is in trouble. But at the same time, we see people all over the world who are mobilizing and doing their best to make sure that it gets defeated. And I think on that note, I'll end. I think that hope is in the air. And I think the thing that we have to remember is that no society is ever just enough. The fighting never ends. The struggle never ends. So thank you.
I think